My name is Alexis Rivera, and when I was 16, my parents left me to die in the Mojave Desert. 20 years later, I'm the one who found their bodies in the exact same spot. But let me start with the call that changed everything. Again. The radio crackled to life at 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October. I was already at the station, coffee growing cold in my hands, reviewing yesterday's incident reports. The desert never sleeps, and neither do we. Search and rescue doesn't keep office hours. Chief Rivera, we've got a Code 7 in Sector 12, 2 bodies discovered by a day hiker approximately 40 minutes ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dispatcher's voice was steady, professional. Rachel had been doing this for 8 years. She'd delivered news of car accidents, lost climbers, overdoses, and heart attacks with the same calm efficiency. But something in her tone made my grip tighten on the radio. Copy that? Coordinates? She rattled off the GPS numbers. My pen froze halfway through writing them down. The coffee mug slipped from my other hand, ceramic shattering against the concrete floor. Hot liquid splashed across my boots, but I barely felt it. Chief? Did you copy? I cleared my throat, forcing my voice steady. Confirmed. Assembling team now. ETA 30 minutes. But my hands were shaking as I set down the radio. Those coordinates, I knew them by heart. They were burned into my memory, like a brand, like a scar that never quite healed right. They were the exact location where I nearly died at 16. Where my parents had left me with a half-empty water bottle and a lie about coming back for me. Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway, already suited up, gear bag slung over his shoulder. At 28, he had the eager efficiency of someone who'd found their calling early. He'd been with our unit for 6 months, and his enthusiasm reminded me why I loved this work. Most days. "Ready when you are, Chief," he said, then noticed the broken mug. "Everything okay?" "Fine, just clumsy." I grabbed paper towels, buying myself a few seconds to compose my face. "Standard recovery operation. 2 adult victims, preliminary cause unknown. Scene preservation is priority until we determine if there's anything suspicious." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious how?" "Could be anything. Exposure, medical emergency, accident. We'll know more when we get there." But I already knew. Deep in my gut, in that place where instinct lives, I knew exactly what we'd find. The desert doesn't give back what it takes easily, and it had been keeping a secret for 20 years. The drive took 43 minutes. 43 minutes of forcing small talk about weather patterns and equipment maintenance, while my mind raced through memories I'd spent 2 decades trying to bury. The familiar landscape rolled past my window. Joshua trees standing like ancient sentinels, rock formations that looked like sleeping giants, beauty that could kill you if you didn't respect it. As we got closer to the coordinates, I found myself checking and rechecking our water supplies, making sure everyone had proper sun protection, the automatic habits of someone who'd learned the hard way that the desert showed no mercy to the unprepared. "There's the trailhead," Cooper called out, pointing to a small dirt parking area where a single car sat baking in the morning sun. We pulled up beside it. The hiker who'd found the bodies was waiting for us, sitting in whatever shade his Honda Civic could provide. He looked shaken, the way people always did when they stumbled across death in a place they expected to find peace. "You the rescue team?" he asked as we approached. "I'm Chief Rivera. You're the one who called it in." He nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the early hour. "Mark Chen. I was just doing my usual morning hike when I almost stepped on them." "Can you show us exactly where you found them?" Mark led us up a familiar trail. Every step felt like walking backwards through time. The path curved around a cluster of boulders, then opened into a small clearing surrounded by desert scrub. And there, in the center of that clearing, were 2 shapes that had once been human beings. My team got to work immediately, establishing a perimeter, photographing the scene, taking initial notes. Professional efficiency in motion. But I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, my heart hammering against my ribs. because I was standing in the exact spot where I'd spent 3 days dying 20 years ago. The bodies lay about 15 feet apart, partially buried by 2 decades of desert wind and sand. What remained of their clothing was sun-bleached and tattered, but I could see enough. A faded blue baseball cap that I remembered seeing every morning across the breakfast table, a distinctive silver bracelet that had caught the light when its owner counted drug money in our garage. My parents, Maria and Carlos Rivera, the people who'd brought me into this world and then tried to erase me from it. Chief? Jake's voice seemed to come from very far away. You want to start with scene documentation? I blinked, forcing myself back to the present. My team was looking at me expectantly, waiting for orders. Professional distance, emotional control, the mantras that had gotten me through every crisis for the past 15 years. Yes, standard protocol. Martinez, initial assessment of the remains. Cooper, full photo documentation before we disturb anything. Jake, help me establish the grid. My voice sounded normal, steady, like I was looking at strangers instead of the people who'd left me to die in this exact spot. But my hands betrayed me as I unrolled the measuring tape, a slight tremor that I hoped no one would notice. Jake, sharp-eyed as always, glanced at me, but said nothing. Mark Chen, the hiker, hovered at the perimeter. Do you need me to stick around? We'll need a full statement, I told him, but you can wait by the vehicles if you'd rather not watch this part. He nodded gratefully and headed back down the trail. I envied him, the luxury of walking away from something that made you uncomfortable. Martinez approached the first body with the careful reverence we always showed the dead. Adult male, appears to be in his 60s, significant decomposition, but based on clothing and personal effects, I'd estimate time of death at several months minimum. Several months, not 20 years. They'd come back. After all this time, they'd come back to this place. Any obvious signs of trauma? I asked, proud that my voice didn't shake. Nothing immediately apparent, but I'll know more once we get them to the morgue. I nodded, making notes on my clipboard. Just another case, just another recovery. Except my pin grip was so tight I was probably leaving gouges in the paper. Cooper was documenting the scene with methodical precision, his camera clicking steadily. Chief, you should see this. He was crouched near the second body, pointing at something half buried in the sand nearby. A water bottle. Plastic, the kind you could buy at any gas station. But the sight of it hit me like a physical blow. Because I remembered that water bottle. I remembered the weight of it in my desperate hands as I'd rationed out sips that couldn't possibly last 3 days. I remembered shaking it next to my ear, hearing the pathetic slosh of the last few ounces while the sun beat down mercilessly. Personal effects, Cooper continued, oblivious to my internal earthquake. Looks like they had some supplies with them. I forced myself to crouch down next to him, to look at what remained of my parents' final journey. A small backpack, its fabric rotted and tattered, the scattered contents of someone's last desperate attempt at survival, energy bars reduced to crumbs, a flashlight with corroded batteries, and GPS coordinates scrawled on a piece of paper that the desert wind had tried to steal, but hadn't quite managed to claim. Bag everything. Chain of custody protocols. Jake was working near the male body, carefully cataloging personal effects. Got a wallet here, Chief. Driver's license still readable. My stomach clenched. Name? Carlos Rivera. Expired in 2018, but the photo's clear enough. He looked up at me. Same last name as you. Relative? The question hung in the air like heat shimmer. My team had stopped their work, waiting for my answer. I could feel their eyes on me, could sense the subtle shift in energy that comes when people realize something significant is happening. I had 2 choices: reveal the personal connection and potentially compromise the investigation, or lie to people who trusted me with their lives on a regular basis. It's possible, I said finally. Rivera is a common name, but let me see the license.
Martinez looked up sharply. Conflict how? I knew them. Years ago. The understatement of the century. Professional ethics require that I step back from certain aspects of the investigation. It was the truth, even if it wasn't the whole truth, and it bought me time to figure out how to handle a situation that no amount of training had prepared me for. Should we call in another team? Cooper asked. No. We finished the recovery, but I'll need to contact Dr. Vasquez directly about the examination, and Detective Chen from the county will probably want to be involved. Detective Sarah Chen, the woman who'd investigated my abandonment 20 years ago and never been able to close the case. She was going to have some very interesting questions when she found out whose bodies we'd just discovered. Jake was still watching me with those sharp eyes of his. You okay, Chief? You seem a little... I'm fine, I said too quickly. Just want to make sure we do this by the book. When there's any chance of personal connection, we err on the side of caution. He nodded, but I could see the questions forming. Jake was observant, and I wasn't hiding my reaction as well as I thought I was. I stepped away from the bodies, pulling out my radio to call Dr. Vasquez. I needed someone I trusted to handle the examination, someone who knew my history and could navigate the ethical minefield this had just become. But as I walked to the edge of the clearing to make the call, I found myself looking back at the spot where I'd nearly died. The rock formation where I'd huddled during the worst heat of those 3 days, the patch of scrub where I dug desperately for roots that might contain water. My parents had come back. After 20 years, they'd returned to the scene of their crime, and the desert had claimed them the same way it had nearly claimed me. The irony wasn't lost on me. The abandoned daughter had become the rescuer, and now I was the one tasked with bringing my would-be killers home. Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived within the hour, her county medical examiner's van kicking up a small dust storm as it navigated the rough desert road. I'd worked with Elena on dozens of cases over the past 5 years. She was thorough, compassionate, and most importantly, she knew my story. When I'd called her directly instead of going through official channels, she'd understood immediately that this was more than a routine recovery. "Alexis," she said as she approached, her voice carefully neutral, "walk me through what we have." I briefed her on the scene, the preliminary findings, the potential timeline. Professional words for an utterly unprofessional situation. She listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, her dark eyes taking in details that others might miss. "And the personal connection?" she asked quietly when we were far enough from my team that they couldn't overhear me. "It's them, Elena. My parents. The ones who left me here." She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the desert landscape. Elena had heard the full story during one of our late-night conversations after a particularly difficult case. She knew what this place meant to me, what finding them here would do to me. "Are you sure you want to continue with this?" she asked. "I can call in another team, have you transferred to a different case." The offer was tempting. Walk away, let someone else deal with the ghosts. But something stubborn in me refused to back down. Maybe it was professional pride. Maybe it was the need to see this through to the end. Or maybe it was just the same survival instinct that had kept me alive for 3 days in this desert 20 years ago. "I need to finish this," I said, "but I want everything documented properly. No questions about procedure or bias." Elena nodded, but I could see the questions forming. "Then let's do this right." She set up her examination area with the methodical precision I'd come to respect. My team continued their work, photographing, measuring, documenting every detail of the scene, but I found myself focusing on the scattered personal effects, trying to piece together the story of what had brought my parents back here. The GPS coordinates Cooper had found were written in my mother's handwriting. I recognized the careful script, each number formed with the precision of someone who'd learned English as a second language and took pride in getting it right. But why these coordinates? Why this exact spot? "Chief?" Jake appeared at my elbow holding an evidence bag. "Found this about 10 feet from the bodies. Thought you should see it." Inside the bag was a small metal object, corroded by years in the desert, but still recognizable. A key. And not just any key, one of those small ones used for safety deposit boxes or storage lockers. My blood went cold. Because I remember seeing keys like that before in the garage where I discovered my parents' drug operation, where I'd found bags of white powder and stacks of cash that 16-year-old me couldn't even begin to count. "Any idea what it opens?" Jake asked. Before I could answer, Alana called out from where she was examining the remains. "Alexis, can you come over here?" I walked over to where she was crouched beside my father's body, her gloved hands carefully examining something near his waist. "Cell phone." Old model, probably from the early 2000s. The battery's long dead, but the case protected it pretty well. She looked up at me. If we can get the data recovered, it might tell us when they died, maybe even why they were here. I stared down at the phone, the same model my father had carried when I was 16 years old, the one he'd used to coordinate drug deals, thinking his teenage daughter was too naive to figure out what all those late-night conversations were about.
There's something else, Elena continued. Look at their positioning. They're not together. They're spread apart, like they were searching for something when they collapsed. She was right. Now that she'd pointed it out, I could see it. The bodies were positioned as if they'd been moving in different directions when death finally claimed them, searching, looking for something specific. The pieces started coming together in my mind like a puzzle I didn't want to solve. The coordinates in my mother's handwriting, the key, the fact that they died in the exact spot where they'd abandoned me 20 years ago. They'd been using this location all along. Before they'd brought me here to die, this had been one of their cache sites, a place to bury drugs or money or whatever else they'd needed to hide from the law. And after 20 years, they'd come back to retrieve it. But age and illness had caught up with them. Or maybe they'd just underestimated the desert, the same way they'd hoped it would kill me. The desert doesn't care about your plans. It doesn't care about your past sins or your despot schemes. It just takes what it wants. Elena, I said quietly, I think they came back for something they buried here, long before they abandoned me. She looked at me sharply. You think this was a cache site? I think it explains why they chose this spot to leave me. It wasn't random. They knew this place. They'd been here before. The irony was bitter as desert wind. They'd tried to bury me in the same place where they'd buried their secrets. And in the end, both of them had ended up buried here instead. My radio crackled. Chief Rivera, this is dispatch. Detective Chen is en route to your location. ETA 15 minutes. My stomach dropped. Sarah Chen, the detective who'd investigated my abandonment case and never been able to close it for lack of evidence. The woman who'd sat across from me in a sterile interview room 20 years ago and promised that she'd find my parents and bring them to justice. She was about to get her chance, just not the way either of us had expected. Copy that, I replied. We'll be ready. Elena caught my expression. The original investigating officer? I nodded. This is going to be interesting. Martinez approached with his preliminary findings. Based on the level of decomposition and the condition of the clothing, I'd estimate death occurred somewhere between 6 and 18 months ago. But Dr. Vasquez will be able to narrow that down once we get them back to the lab. 6 to 18 months. Recent enough that my parents had been alive and free for the vast majority of the 20 years since they'd abandoned me. They'd gotten away with it. They'd gone on with their lives, while I'd struggled through foster care and trauma therapy and the long process of rebuilding myself from the terrified girl they'd left to die. But the desert had been patient, and in the end, it had gotten its justice. The sound of an approaching vehicle made us all look up. Detective Chen's unmarked sedan was making its way carefully up the rough road, followed by a second car I didn't recognize. Showtime, Elena murmured. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I took a deep breath, tasting dust and heat and the weight of 20 years of unfinished business. Whatever came next, I was going to face it the same way I'd faced everything else since that 16-year-old girl had crawled out of this desert alive. One step at a time, with my eyes open and my back straight. Because I wasn't that helpless girl anymore. I was Chief Alexis Rivera, and I'd built a life dedicated to making sure nobody else got abandoned the way I'd had, even if it meant confronting the ghosts that had just crawled out of the sand. The sight of Detective Chen's car triggered something deep in my memory, like a key turning in a lock I'd tried to keep sealed. Suddenly, I was 16 again, standing in the garage behind our house, staring at what I never was supposed to see. It had been a Tuesday afternoon in September 2004. I'd come home early from school because of a migraine, walking quietly through the house so I wouldn't wake my mother from her afternoon nap. I'd needed my bike from the garage, planning to ride to the pharmacy for something stronger than the aspirin we kept in the kitchen. The garage door was cracked open just enough to let in light, just enough for me to see my father hunched over a workbench, weighing white powder on a digital scale. Stacks of cash sat beside him, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. Plastic bags, measuring spoons, the kind of setup I'd seen in movies but never imagined in my own home. I'd frozen in the doorway, my 16-year-old brain struggling to process what I was seeing. This explained so much. The late-night phone calls, the visitors who never stayed long, the way my parents would stop talking when I entered the room. Alexis. My father's voice was sharp, dangerous. "What are you doing here?" I needed my bike. I'm sick, so I came home early." He'd stood slowly, his dark eyes calculating. Behind him, I could see more bags of powder, more money than our family should have had. My mother appeared in the doorway behind me, her face pale and tight. "How much did you see?" she asked. The smart answer would have been nothing. The safe answer would have been to lie, to pretend I hadn't understood what I was looking at. But I'd been raised to tell the truth, and 16-year-old me hadn't learned that sometimes the truth could get you killed. "Everything," I whispered. The look that passed between my parents in that moment had chilled me to the bone. Not anger, not disappointment. Cold calculation. The look of people deciding whether someone was an asset or a liability.
"We need to talk," my father had said. "Family meeting, tonight." But there'd been no family meeting. Instead, the next morning, they'd announced a camping trip. Just the three of us, they'd said. Family bonding time in the desert. I'd been excited. We rarely did things together as a family. I should have known better. In the present, I watched Detective Chen climb out of her car, older now, but still carrying herself with the same determined stride I remembered from 20 years ago. She'd been the one good thing to come out of that nightmare. The one person who'd believed that something terrible had happened to me. But right now, I needed to focus on the memories, because understanding why my parents had chosen this location might be the key to understanding everything. The camping trip had started normally enough. We'd loaded the car with supplies, driven out into the Mojave, set up camp in this same clearing. My parents had seemed almost relaxed, more like the family I'd always wished we could be. It wasn't until the second day that things had started to feel wrong. The morning my parents abandoned me had started with my mother making pancakes over the camp stove. She'd been humming, as she flipped them. I'd been so hungry for normal family moments that I'd convinced myself this trip was exactly what it seemed to be. "Why don't you go explore a bit?" my father had suggested after breakfast. "Your mother and I want to scout some hiking trails for later." I'd been happy to wander, taking my water bottle and a granola bar, planning to be gone for maybe an hour. The desert was beautiful in the early morning light, all golden sand and purple shadows. I'd found a small canyon about a mile from camp and spent time sketching the rock formations. When I'd returned, they were gone. Not just gone for a hike, gone completely. The car, the camping gear, everything, except my sleeping bag and a half-empty water bottle. Even the tire tracks had been carefully brushed away. At first, I'd thought it was a mistake. Maybe they'd gone for supplies and expected me to wait. But as the hours passed and the sun climbed higher, panic had started to set in. By noon, I'd understood the truth. They weren't coming back. The first day had been the worst psychologically. The betrayal had hit me in waves, alternating with desperate hope that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. I'd screamed until my throat was raw, hoping they might still be close enough to hear me. I'd climbed the highest rocks I could find, scanning the horizon for any sign of help. The second day had been about survival. The Girl Scout training I'd complained about so many times suddenly became the difference between life and death. I'd rationed my water into tiny sips, found shade during the worst heat, tried to signal for help with reflected sunlight from my bracelet. By the third day, I was hallucinating, seeing mirages that looked like rescue vehicles, hearing voices in the wind. My lips had been cracked and bleeding. My tongue had felt too big for my mouth. I knew I was dying. That's when I'd started walking. It had been a desperate decision. Stay and die for certain, or walk and probably die trying. But at least walking felt like doing something, like fighting back against the people who'd left me here. I'd walked for hours, following what I hoped was the direction back to the main road. My vision was swimming. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. But I'd kept moving because moving was the only choice I'd had left. And then I'd heard the helicopter. 20 years later, I could still hear the rhythmic thump of rotor blades cutting through desert air, the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard in my life. Tommy Blackhorse had been leading the search and rescue team that day, a Navajo Nation member with deep desert knowledge and instincts that bordered on supernatural. He'd spotted me from the air, a tiny figure stumbling across the sand like a broken doll. "Found a kid," his voice had crackled over the radio. "Looks like severe dehydration. Need medical evac immediately." They'd landed 50 yards away, the helicopter's downdraft stinging my face with sand. Tommy had reached me first, his weathered hands gentle as he'd checked my pulse, lifted my eyelids, assessed my condition with the calm competence of someone who'd done this countless times. "Hey there, daughter," he said, his voice soft despite the noise of the helicopter. "I'm Tommy. We're here to help. Can you tell me your name?" "Alexis," I croaked through cracked lips. "Alexis Rivera." "Well, Alexis Rivera, you're one tough young lady. How long have you been out here?" 3 days. My parents, they left me." I'd seen something change in Tommy's expression then. Not surprise exactly, but a hardening around his eyes that suggested he'd seen this kind of thing before. "We're gonna get you out of here," he promised. "But first, I need you to drink this, small sips." The water had tasted like salvation, like life itself flowing back into my body. But even as I drank, Tommy had been studying the area around us, his experienced eyes reading signs in the sand that I couldn't see. "Martinez," he called to his partner, "check about a quarter-mile north. Look for a campsite or vehicle tracks." They'd found nothing, of course. My parents had been too careful for that. But Tommy's instincts were right. This hadn't been an accident. During the helicopter ride to the hospital, Tommy had sat beside me, making sure I stayed conscious, keeping up a steady stream of calm conversation. "You did good out there, Alexis," he'd said. 3 days in the desert with minimal water, and you're still fighting. That takes real strength." "I just wanted to live," I'd whispered. "That's the most important thing," he'd replied. "The will to survive. Everything else can be taught, but that has to come from inside." Those words had stayed with me through everything that followed. The hospital stay, the police investigation, the foster homes. Tommy had visited me during my recovery, bringing books about desert survival and stories about his work with search and rescue. "You ever think about what you want to do when you grow up?" he'd asked one day. "I want to help people," I'd said, without hesitation, "like you helped me." He'd smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen from an adult in longer than I could remember. "Then maybe, someday, you'll come work with us. The desert needs people who understand it, people who faced it and survived." In the present, I pulled out my phone and called Tommy's number. Even retired, he remained my go-to advisor for anything involving the desert or difficult cases. "Alexis," his familiar voice answered after 2 rings. "What's going on?" "I need you out here, Tommy. I've got a situation it's complicated." "How complicated?" I looked at the bodies of my parents, at Detective Chen approaching with purposeful strides, at my team working diligently to process a scene they didn't know had shaped my entire life. "It's them," I said simply. "The ones who left me." There was a long pause. Then,
I'll be there in an hour. Detective Sarah Chen looked exactly like I remembered her, just with more gray in her black hair and deeper lines around her eyes. 20 years of carrying unsolved cases would do that to a person. She'd been a young detective then, knew enough to still believe that every case could be solved if you just worked hard enough. My case had taught her otherwise. "Chief Rivera," she said as she approached, her voice carefully professional. Then her eyes widened as recognition hit. "Alexis? Alexis Rivera?" "Hello, Detective Chen." She stopped walking, her hand moving unconsciously to her badge. I could see her mind racing, trying to process the implications of finding me here, in charge of a recovery operation at the exact location where I'd been abandoned 20 years ago. "The bodies," she said slowly. "Are they Maria and Carlos Rivera, my parents?" The words hung in the desert air like heat shimmer. Chen closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, I saw a mix of vindication and sadness that I recognized all too well. "After all these years," she murmured. "How?" "That's what we're trying to figure out. Preliminary examination suggests they died within the last year. They came back, Detective. After 20 years, they came back to this place." Chen looked around the clearing, taking in the scene with eyes that had learned to read landscapes of human tragedy. They were looking for something. It wasn't a question. Chen had always been sharp, able to see patterns that others missed. It's why she'd believed me when other adults had suggested I was making up stories about being abandoned. "We found GPS coordinates and a key. I think this was one of their cache sites long before they brought me here." Chen nodded slowly. "That would explain the location choice. They knew this area, knew it was remote enough that—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. We both knew what this place had been intended for. "I investigated this case for 3 years. Never stopped looking for them. Even after it went cold, I'd run their names through the system periodically, check with Border Patrol, other agencies. They just vanished. They got away with it. For 20 years, they got away with trying to kill their own daughter. But they came back," Chen observed. "The question is why? What was so valuable that they'd risk returning to the scene?" That's when Ilana approached us, her expression grim. "Alexis, Detective Chen, I think you need to see this." She led us to where Cooper was working with a metal detector, sweeping the area around the bodies. The device had been beeping steadily for the past few minutes. "There's something buried here," Cooper said, "about 3 feet down, roughly 20 feet from the bodies." Chen and I exchanged glances. "Dig it up," I said. It took 15 minutes to uncover what my parents had died trying to retrieve: a large plastic container, the kind used for storing holiday decorations, wrapped in multiple layers of trash bags and duct tape. Inside, preserved by the dry desert air, were bricks of cocaine, stacks of cash, and what looked like business records going back decades. "Jesus," Chen breathed. "How much is here?" Ilana was photographing everything before we moved it. Rough estimate, maybe 200,000 in cash, plus the drugs. Street value could be close to $500,000. I stared down at the cash, understanding finally clicking into place. This wasn't just about drugs. This was about retirement money. A nest egg buried in the desert, waiting for the day that my parents could safely retrieve it and disappear forever. But age had made them careless, or desperate, or maybe they'd just run out of other options. "The dates on these records," Chen said, examining some of the paperwork, "they go back to 2003. They were using the site for at least a year before they brought you here." "Which means they'd already decided to eliminate me before that camping trip," I said. "The discovery in the garage was just the final trigger." Chen's jaw tightened. "They planned to kill you and then come back for their money once the heat died down." "Except there was no heat," I pointed out. "You couldn't prove anything. They could have just taken the money and left town." "But they panicked," Elena suggested. "Criminals often make irrational decisions when they think they're cornered."
I looked at the scattered remains of my parents, at the money they died trying to retrieve, at the career I'd built on the foundation of their betrayal. The desert had been patient. It had waited 20 years to collect its debt. But standing there, I didn't feel the satisfaction I had expected. I felt something else entirely, something that surprised me with its clarity. Peace. Not because they were dead, but because the questions that had haunted me for 20 years finally had answers. They hadn't abandoned me on impulse. They hadn't left me because I was a burden or because they didn't love me. They'd tried to kill me because I was a threat to their criminal enterprise. It was cold. It was calculated. But it wasn't personal. And somehow, that made all the difference. Dr. Elena Vasquez worked with a methodical precision of someone who'd learned that the dead deserved nothing less than absolute thoroughness. Back at the county morgue, she'd laid out everything we'd recovered from the scene like pieces of a puzzle that would finally reveal its complete picture. Cause of death for both victims was dehydration and hyperthermia, she announced to the small group gathered in the examination room. Detective Chen, Tommy Blackhorse, and I stood around the metal table where the evidence was spread out under harsh fluorescent lights. Based on tissue decomposition and environmental factors, I'd estimate time of death at approximately 8 to 10 months ago. 8 months. They'd been dead since winter, their bodies slowly mummifying in the dry desert air, while I'd gone about my life completely unaware that the ghost from my past had finally been laid to rest. Any signs of foul play? Chan asked, though we all suspected we knew the answer. None. This was environmental exposure, pure and simple. They died the same way their daughter nearly did 20 years ago. Elena's voice carried a note of grim irony that wasn't lost on any of us. Tommy stepped closer to examine the personal effects laid out on the adjacent table. The GPS device we found in my father's pocket had yielded its secrets once the tech team had extracted the data. The GPS shows multiple trips to this location over the past 2 years. Looks like they'd been planning this retrieval for a while. Chen picked up a water-stained notebook we'd found in my mother's backpack. Medical appointments, oncology, cardiology. Looks like they were both dealing with serious health issues. That explained the desperation. Facing their own mortality, they'd decided to risk everything for one last score. The money buried in the desert represented freedom from medical bills, maybe enough to disappear somewhere with better health care, somewhere they could spend their final years in comfort instead of struggling with the consequences of a lifetime of poor choices. The irony is perfect, isn't it? I said, though there was no satisfaction in my voice. They'd tried to kill me in the place where they'd hidden their retirement fund, and in the end, that same place killed them when they finally came back for it. The physical evidence tells a clear story, Alana continued, pulling out a manila envelope. Your father collapsed first, probably from cardiac stress combined with heat exhaustion. Your mother tried to help him, dragged him about 10 feet before she collapsed as well. They were about 20 feet from the cache site when they died. 20 feet. After all those years, after all that planning, they died within sight of their goal. The desert had shown them the same mercy they'd shown me. None at all. There's something else, Alana continued, pulling out a manila envelope. We found this in your mother's jacket pocket. It's sealed, addressed to you. My hands trembled as I took the envelope. My name was written on the front in my mother's careful script, the same handwriting I'd seen on the GPS coordinates. The paper was yellowed and creased, like it had been carried for a long time. Want me to open it? Chen asked. No, I said, I need to do this. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in my mother's writing. The letter was dated 6 months before their deaths, written in Spanish, the language of her childhood and her deepest emotions. Mi hija, if you are reading this, then we are dead, and you have found us. I know this is not how any mother should speak to her child, but I stopped being your mother the day we left you in the desert. I know this now. Your father, he always said we had no choice, that you would have turned us in, destroyed everything we had built. But I knew better. I knew you would have kept our secrets because you loved us. Children always protect their parents, even when their parents do not deserve protection. We were cowards, Alexis. We chose money over our child. And the desert has made us pay for that choice. I am dying now. Slowly.
and your father's heart is failing. We came back for the money because we thought it would save us. But money cannot save cowards from themselves. I do not ask for forgiveness. I do not deserve it. But I want you to know that leaving you was the worst thing I ever did. Worse than the drugs, worse than the stealing, worse than all of it. Every day since then, I have seen your face in my dreams. Every day I have wondered if you survived, if you grew up, if you became the good woman I knew you could be. The money in the desert, it is yours now. Blood money, yes. But maybe you can make something clean from it. Maybe you can help other lost children the way we should have helped you. I love you, mija. I always loved you. I was just too weak to choose love over fear. Tu madre, Maria. The paper shook in my hands. I read it twice, then a third time, before the words really sank in. My mother had known. In her final months, she'd understood exactly what they'd done and what it had cost them. Tommy placed a weathered hand on my shoulder. The dead sometimes find their voices too late, he said quietly, but at least they find them. I folded the letter carefully, slipping it back into the envelope. 20 years of anger and confusion and wondering why, and now I had my answer. Not excuses, not justification, just the simple, devastating truth. They'd been cowards who'd chosen wrong and spent the rest of their lives living with that choice. Chen was studying the cash inventory. What do you want to do about the money, Alexis? Legally, it should be seized as evidence of criminal activity, but given the circumstances, give it to the search and rescue program. Training, equipment, whatever they need. Let something good come from it. The drugs? Destroy them. All of it. Elena nodded approvingly. I'll make sure the paperwork reflects that the money was recovered property with no living claimants. Clean and simple. As we prepared to leave the morgue, Tommy pulled me aside. I want you to know, Alexis, this case never really closed for me. I always believed you, even when others suggested you might have gotten lost on your own. Finding them like this, it validates everything you went through. Thank you, I said. That means more than you know. What will you do now with the bodies? I thought about it for a moment. County burial. No ceremony. They made their choices, and this is where those choices led them. I'm not their daughter anymore. I haven't been for 20 years. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself. Because standing in that morgue, holding my mother's final words, I realized that some connections run deeper than choice, deeper than betrayal, deeper than the desire for revenge or the need for justice. They were my parents. They'd created me and destroyed me and shaped me in ways I was still discovering. And now they were gone. Their story finally complete. The next morning brought the kind of desert sunrise that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this harsh, beautiful landscape. Tommy arrived at the station just as I was finishing my incident report, his old pickup truck kicking up familiar dust clouds in the parking lot. "How are you holding up?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk, with the careful movements of a man whose body had given decades to dangerous work. "Better than I expected," I said, and meant it. "Worse than I hoped." He nodded, understanding without explanation. Tommy had been the one to sit with me through the worst of the nightmares in those early years after the rescue. He'd taught me that healing wasn't about forgetting trauma, but about choosing what to do with the strength that surviving it had given you.
"Your team's asking questions," he said. "Jake especially. That boy's got sharp eyes." I'd been expecting this conversation. My team had worked the recovery operation with their usual professionalism, but I could see the questions building behind their careful silence. They deserved to know why their chief had been acting strangely at what should have been a routine body recovery. "I'll brief them this morning," I said. "They've earned the truth." "All of it?" "Enough of it. They need to understand why I recused myself from certain aspects of the investigation and why Detective Chen was so involved." Tommy was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the desert stretching endlessly toward the mountains. In all my years doing search and rescue, I never stopped being amazed by how the desert teaches us. It strips away everything that doesn't matter and shows us who we really are. What do you think it showed me? That you're exactly who I thought you were 20 years ago. Someone who survives. Someone who helps others survive. The team meeting was harder than I'd expected. Jake, Martinez, and Cooper sat around the conference table, their faces carefully neutral as I explained the personal connection to the case we'd worked yesterday. "The victims were my biological parents," I said without preamble. "They abandoned me in that same location when I was 16. Tommy's team rescued me after 3 days." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. I could see them processing this information, understanding finally why I'd seemed so affected at the scene. Jake spoke first. "Chief, I can't imagine what that must have been like yesterday." "It was difficult," I admitted, "but it was also necessary. Sometimes the past catches up with you in ways you don't expect, and you have to decide how to handle it professionally." Martinez leaned forward. "Is that why you called Dr. Vasquez directly instead of going through normal channels?" "Yes. I needed someone I trusted to handle the examination objectively, someone who could maintain proper procedure while being aware of the personal complications." Cooper, ever practical, asked the question I'd been dreading. "Should we have called in another team, avoided the conflict of interest entirely?" "Maybe," I said honestly, "but I made the decision to see it through. Whether that was the right call or not, I'll leave to others to judge." "For what it's worth," Jake said, "you handled it exactly like I'd want my chief to handle it. Professional, thorough, and with respect for everyone involved." The words meant more than he probably realized. These people trusted me with their lives on a regular basis. Knowing that I hadn't lost that trust, even after they learned about my connection to the case, felt like validation of everything I'd tried to build since Tommy had pulled me out of the desert 20 years ago. Later that afternoon, as the team prepared for a training exercise in the foothills, I found myself standing in the station parking lot looking out at the desert landscape that had shaped my entire adult life. The place that had nearly killed me had also given me my purpose, my career, my identity. Tommy appeared beside me, following my gaze toward the distant mountains. Funny how things come full circle sometimes. Is it closure? I keep waiting to feel, I don't know, resolution, peace, something. Closure's overrated. What you've got is something better. Understanding. You know now why they did what they did. You know they suffered for it. And you know that you built something good from something terrible. He was right. The anger I'd carried for 20 years hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else. Something that felt less like a wound and more like a scar. Still visible, still sensitive, but no longer bleeding. There's going to be media attention. When word gets out about the connection between the victims and the chief who found them, reporters are going to want the story. How do you want to handle that? Honestly, let them know that sometimes the job requires you to face things you'd rather not face, that professional duty means putting the mission ahead of personal comfort. Tommy smiled. That sounds like something the girl I rescued 20 years ago might say. Different girl, same values. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, I made one last decision about how to handle the aftermath of finding my parents' bodies. I was going to keep working, keep doing search and rescue, keep making sure that other people didn't die alone in the desert the way my parents had. Not because I owed them anything, but because I owed myself the life I'd fought so hard to build.
The desert had taught me that survival was about more than just staying alive. It was about what you did with the life you'd managed to keep. 3 weeks after we recovered the bodies, I found myself driving back to the site. Not for any official reason. The case was closed, the reports filed, the evidence processed. I went because I needed to stand in that place one more time, not as Chief Rivera conducting a recovery operation, but as Alexis, the girl who'd crawled out of the desert alive 20 years ago. The coordinates were burned into my memory now in a different way. Not as numbers that triggered panic and flashbacks, but as a location where two very different stories ended. My parents' story of choices and consequences, and my story of survival and transformation.
I stood in the center of the clearing, in the exact spot where I'd spent 3 days dying. The rock formation where I'd huddled during the worst heat was still there, unchanged. The patch of scrub where I desperately searched for anything that might contain water looked exactly the same. But I was different. Fundamentally, completely different. At 16, I had been a terrified girl who discovered that the people who were supposed to protect me were actually trying to kill me. I'd survived through luck and stubbornness and the basic human refusal to give up when giving up would be easier. At 36, I was someone who'd turned that survival into purpose. Someone who'd taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and used it to make sure the worst didn't happen to others. I thought about my mother's letter, which I'd read dozens of times since Elena had given it to me. Her words about choosing money over their child, about being too weak to choose love over fear. I'd been angry about those words at first. How dare she try to explain away 20 years of abandonment with a letter written when she was facing death? But standing in the place where both her story and mine had played out, I realized that anger was a luxury I no longer needed to carry. She'd been right about one thing. Children do protect their parents, even when their parents don't deserve protection. If they'd trusted me with their secret, I probably would have kept it. I would have been complicit in their crimes, because I'd loved them, and love makes you do stupid things sometimes. Instead, their fear had led them to try to eliminate me entirely, and that choice had set me on a path that had saved far more lives than their drug dealing had ever destroyed. The desert wind picked up, stirring the sand around my feet. In that wind, I could hear echoes of everything this place had witnessed. The fear of a 16-year-old girl facing death alone, the desperate final moments of two people who'd spent decades running from the consequences of their choices, the steady voices of search and rescue professionals doing their jobs with dignity and compassion. All of it was part of the same story. All of it had led to this moment, standing in this place, finally understanding that some questions don't need answers. Some wounds don't need to heal completely. Some stories just need to be accepted for what they are. I pulled out my phone and called Tommy. "I'm at the site," I told him when he answered. "How does it feel?" "Different. Quiet." I paused, trying to find the right words. "I think I'm ready to let it go." All of it? The anger, the need to understand why, the feeling like I'm still that scared girl. I looked around the clearing one more time. I'll always be someone who was abandoned here, but I'm also someone who survived it, someone who turned it into something useful. "That's all any of us can do," Tommy said. "Take what happens to us and decide what to make of it." I'm making search and rescue my life's work. All of it. Training, equipment, outreach. The money from the cash will help, but it's bigger than that. I want to build something that ensures no one dies alone in the desert if we can prevent it. Sounds like a good way to honor what you survived. After I hung up, I spent a few more minutes in the clearing. The sun was setting now, and the temperature was starting to drop. Soon, this place would be cold and dangerous in a completely different way. The desert was always teaching you that survival required constant vigilance, constant adaptation. But I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I respected it, understood it, worked within its rules. The desert had taken my parents because they'd been careless and desperate and unprepared. It had tested me and found me worthy of survival. As I walked back to my truck, I thought about the letter I would write that night. Not to my dead parents, but to the next girl who would find herself alone and scared and convinced that no one was coming to help her. A letter that would be part of the search and rescue orientation materials, something that would let them know that survival was possible, that people who understood what they were going through would come looking for them, that being abandoned didn't have to define you forever. The desert made me who I was. The abandonment shaped me. The survival had strengthened me. And the work that had grown from all of it had given me a purpose that could outlast any personal trauma. Standing at my truck, I looked back one last time at the place where my parents' story had ended and my real story had begun. Then I got in and drove home ready to help write better endings for whoever might need them next. The desert kept its secrets and its lessons in equal measure, but the most important lesson it had taught me was this: survival isn't about what happens to you. It's about what you choose to do with the life you fight to keep. And I was going to keep fighting, keep helping, keep making sure that when someone cried out in the wilderness, there would always be someone listening for their voice. The girl couldn't have been more than 14. Her lips cracked and bleeding, her eyes wide with the kind of terror I recognized in my bones. She clutched an empty water bottle like it might somehow refill itself through sheer desperation. "What's your name?" I asked her, kneeling beside her in the shadow of the helicopter that had just landed. "Emma," she whispered. "Emma Martinez." "Well, Emma Martinez, I'm Alexis Rivera, and we're here to take you home." She'd been missing for 2 days. A family camping trip gone wrong when she'd wandered off to take photos and gotten turned around in terrain that all looked the same. Her parents were still in the waiting room.
We're frantic. The media was calling it a race against time, and my team had been searching since dawn. But we'd found her, dehydrated, scared, but alive. As Jake and Cooper loaded her into the helicopter for medical transport, I stood in the desert where we'd made the rescue. Different coordinates than the ones burned into my memory, but the same harsh beauty, the same unforgiving sun, the same lesson about how quickly things could go wrong in a place that demanded respect. "Chief," Jake called over the rotor noise. "Ready to head back?" "Give me a minute." I watched the helicopter disappear toward the horizon, carrying Emma to safety, to her parents, to a second chance she'd almost not gotten. In 5 years since we'd found my parents' bodies, we'd conducted 847 search and rescue operations. We'd brought home 823 people alive. The numbers mattered. Each one represented someone's daughter, son, mother, father, sister, brother, friend. Each successful rescue was a family that didn't have to live with the hollow ache of not knowing. Each person we found was proof that sometimes someone does come looking for you. The Rivera Foundation for Desert Safety had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when I'd first donated that blood money 5 years ago. Training programs for hikers, emergency beacon rentals, educational outreach to schools, a 24-hour response team with the best equipment money could buy. But the part I was most proud of was the letter program. Every person we rescued received a packet of information that included a letter I'd written explaining that survival was possible, that being lost didn't define you, that there were people who understood what it felt like to be abandoned and afraid, and those people would never stop looking for others who needed help. Tommy had retired officially 3 years ago, but he still consulted on difficult cases. His wisdom about reading the desert has saved more lives than either of us could count. At 73, he moved a little slower, but his instincts remained as sharp as ever. "You know what the difference is between you and your parents?" he'd asked me recently during one of our regular coffee meetings. "What's that?" "They saw the desert as a place to bury their mistakes. You see it as a place to dig people out of theirs." Detective Sarah Chen had been promoted to lieutenant, but she still called whenever a missing person case had unusual circumstances. The guilt she'd carried about not being able to prosecute my parents had finally lifted when their bodies were found. "Justice delayed," she'd said, "but not justice denied." Dr. Elena Vasquez had become our go-to forensic consultant, her gentle professionalism helping families understand what had happened to their loved ones when we weren't able to bring them home alive. She'd been the one to officially close my parents' case, marking it as resolved by natural consequences. The media attention had been intense for a while. "Abandoned daughter becomes rescuer who found parents' bodies," had been the headline that followed me for months. But the story had ultimately helped more than it had hurt.
Donations poured in, volunteer applications spiked. People wanted to be part of something that turned tragedy into purpose. I still carried my mother's letter in my wallet, though I rarely read it anymore. Not because I'd forgotten what it said, but because I no longer needed its validation. I'd forgiven her, not because she'd asked for it in a letter, but because carrying anger was a luxury I couldn't afford when there were people to save. Standing in the desert where we'd just rescued Emma, I thought about all the ways a story could end. My parents' story ended with poor choices and natural consequences. My story as an abandoned daughter ended the moment Tommy's helicopter appeared on the horizon 25 years ago. The story I was writing now was different. It was about transformation, about taking the worst thing that could happen to you and using it to prevent the worst from happening to others. About understanding that survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about what you did with the life you fought to keep. My radio crackled. "Chief Rivera, we have another call coming in. Missing hiker in Sector 15. I looked out at the endless expanse of desert, beautiful and dangerous and patient. Somewhere out there, someone was lost. Someone was scared. Someone was hoping that help would come. And it would. It always would. Because that's what we do. We go into the places that want to swallow people whole, and we bring them home." "Copy that," I said into the radio. "On our way." The desert had taught me everything I needed to know about survival. Now it was time to pass those lessons on. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.